Hey folks, how's everybody doing? I hope you are enjoying your holidays here. All right, and as I mentioned back when I was doing the 5600 video, I want to use the opportunity to do a comparison video, which is going to include the Ryzen 3 3200G and the RTX 2060 paired with the i9-9900K. Okay. I know some of you are planning to build a PC, and if emulation is something that you are taking into consideration for your build, then you're probably wondering what are the give and takes, especially when it comes to GPU and CPU. So before I get into that comparison, I do want to just quickly summarize each build and point out a few specs. Okay. First up is the Ryzen 3 3200G. It has 4 cores, 4 threads with a boost clock speed of 4 GHz and an integrated Vega 8 GPU, which I overclocked to 1700 MHz. Next is the Ryzen 5 5600G, which has 6 cores, 12 threads with a boost clock speed of 4.4 GHz and an integrated Vega 7 GPU with a clock speed of 1900 MHz. Last is the i9-9900K, which has 8 cores, 6 threads with a boost clock speed of 5 GHz and a dedicated RTX 2060 GPU with a clock speed of 1755 MHz. Okay. For the comparisons, I have selected one game for each emulator. Okay. So I wanted to start with the 4th generation just to take a quick look back at the BSNES emulation. As you saw in the previous video, the 5600G had issues using all the available enhancements on the OpenGL API. Since I've tested the 3200G, there has been some driver updates, and I wanted to just know if things have changed. So let's just go ahead and take a look. So just as a reminder, I've turned on run ahead for 1 frame, set mode 7 upscaler to 1920p, and up the emulated CPU to 120%. As you can see, things have not changed. The minute I hit an area that utilizes mode 7, the frame rate drops immediately. Based on what I've seen from the 5600G, it looks like the 3200G is CPU bound here. When we look at the 3200G, it is at a max 4 GHz. If we go back to the 5600G, it's fluctuating between 4.25 GHz and the max 4.4 GHz respectively. So I can only assume that the CPU of the 3200G is causing the bottleneck here. Even when you look at the individual cores of the 3200G, and let me go ahead and go back to that here. Oh, what did I do with 32? So even when you look at the 32, the individual cores of the 3200G, they are doing far more work compared to what the 5600G is outputting. I also want to apologize for my 3200G capture. I thought I could brute force 1080p 60 frames per second using OBS, but my capture card only supports 60 frames per second at 720p, and so things are going to not look smooth as they should for certain games here. Okay. All right, so now let's get into the 5th generation using the DuckStation PlayStation emulator. The title I chose for that was Crash Team Racing, and the biggest reason I chose this title in particular is because not only can I upscale the game to higher resolution, I can also double the frame rate through overclocking the emulated CPU. Okay. In terms of settings, I use the Vulkan API upscaled to 1440p, turned on 2x MSAA, and overclocked the emulated CPU to 108%. So let's take a look at 3200G first. This time around, it looks like we are CPU bound, which is the major reason I couldn't upscale to 4K on this title. It is constantly hitting 100%, and in some specs, in some spots, the frame rate is dropping, but for the most part, it is consistent. Now we're going to go ahead and look at the 5600G here. And it's definitely not affecting the GPU. It's kind of staying around 40%. Looking at this, it may have you believe that the 5600G can probably do 4K, but in my testing, it could not keep a consistent frame rate. Even with that being said, the 5600G is far better at handling 1440p than the 3200G in this case. From what I gather, the CPU clock speed is really helping in this case to keep that percentage lower. It's going at like 1900 megahertz from 400 to 1900 megahertz, whereas the other, the 3200 is 1700 megahertz. All right, and then of course we have the big dog, an RTX 2060 paired with an i9-9900K. Okay. For settings, I upscaled to 4K, turned on 4 times MSAA, overclocked the emulated CPU, and this is the outcome. The GPU is barely around 20%, and looking at my cores and threads, you can see they are barely being used. I do want to mention that the clock speed for the CPU is not going to change throughout these tests, so we'll be looking at the core thread percentages to see where the i9-9900K is being pushed. All right. So now let's go ahead and get into 6th generation titles. We're going to start with the PSX2 PlayStation 2 emulator. All right, and the game I'm going to choose for this one is Black. And like the previous game, I mainly chose this because of the frame rate to unlock. That basically allows you to unlock the 60 frames per second here. All right, so let me go ahead and get that up here. This time around, the 3200G did struggle a bit. In my initial test, it was not even getting close to 60 frames per second. After resetting the computer, things did improve, but I also turned on multi-threaded VU1 and instant V1, which can help with increasing the frame rate. I upscaled it to 720p, did not turn on FXAA or anisotropic filtering, and this is the outcome. The only time that the frame rate dropped was during the firefight between a few NPCs and enemies, and I can kind of get to that point so you guys can see that. So this is kind of where it started to drop the frame rate here when you were getting close to the firefight between them. And it should start coming up in a minute. You'll kind of see it start to drop a bit. But, as you can see, it's kind of starting to drop right there. It does look like we are once again GPU bound here, as the CPU isn't hitting its max clock speed, but the GPU is definitely hitting 100% usage. All right, now let's take a look at the 5600G. Thought I had this all set up, but looks like I don't. Let me go ahead and just kind of forward this a little bit here. So, you can just see that is definitely a big improvement in terms of settings. I upscaled to 1080p, used 16 times anisotropic filtering, and turned on FXAA. And what you see as a result is it's consistent all the way through. One thing I noticed is that the CPU is getting taxed in some areas, but another thing that caught my attention is there are only 2 cores being used, whereas the 3200G was using every core. So I do believe the option to use multi-threaded VU1 is why this is happening. With all that being said, you can still see the GPU, while not at 100%, is definitely up there, and that is how you know upscaling the resolution any higher isn't going to go well. All right, and so now we're going to look at the 2060 and the i9-9900K. All right, so let me just go ahead and pull that up. In terms of settings, I've upscaled it to 4K, used 16 times anisotropic filtering, and enabled FXAA. And as you can see, this is not giving the hardware any trouble in the slightest. A few of the cores are getting worked, but they only seem to be utilizing 50% at the most, and the GPU is primarily in the 40th percentile or the 40th percentile throughout the gameplay. Okay. All right. So yeah. So that's, and I can just move it a little bit further here, so you can. And you can see it's kind of, not as bad here. Let me just. Okay. All right. So next we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Cemu, the XEMU and Xbox emulator. During my original video showcasing of the 3200G, I did not know much about this emulator, but since then it has come a long way and has a ton of compatible games. So the game I chose for this one is Gun Valkyrie. So once again, we're going to start with the 3200G. The only setting I did was upscaling to 2x, which I believe is 960p. And off of the bat, you really see the cores getting pushed. Despite this, the CPU isn't hitting that boost clock. It does seem like it's very much CPU limited, with the GPU fluctuating as high as 90%, but it really isn't constant. Even with that being the case, pushing the resolution any higher causes the frame rate to drop further, especially when you're using the booster rockets. All right, so now let's see how the 5600 does here. I'll get it in just a moment here. It is obviously faring much better in terms of CPU usage. You can see that a few cores and threads are being worked, but definitely not as hard as what we saw with the 3200G. The GPU also doesn't seem to be doing as much work, but as with 3200G, upscaling any further is going to cause drops. Okay. All right. All right, and now for the big kahuna, the 2060 with i9-9900K Fusion here. I decided to keep it at an upscale of 2x after noticing something strange with the frames, the frame rate. It never felt like the frame rate had dropped, but for whatever reason, it's switching from 60 frames per second to 59 frames per second, and I don't really know what's causing it. Just like the 5600G, you can see it's utilizing all the cores and threads, and pretty consistently, it's kind of utilizing them consistently, but definitely not as bad as what I witnessed with the 3200G. Okay. All right. Next, I'm going to go with the Doplhin, a Wii and GameCube emulator. I've decided to forego testing GameCube this time around since we're going to have so many systems that we have to cover here. All right. Let me pull this up here. All right, so I'm going with Tatsunoko versus Capcom for the game. When it comes to fighting games, you definitely don't want to see a drop in frame rate, especially if you're playing against other people. All right. Starting with the 3200G in terms of settings, I upscaled to 720p, turned on 2 times MSAA, and used 60 times anisotropic filtering. Selected FXAA for post processing. As you can see, things are running pretty smoothly. What I really want to make note of is the CPU usage, which, unlike the XEMU, isn't really pushing the individual cores super hard, though it is keeping a consistent boost clock. The GPU seems to fluctuate but stays mainly around 50%. All right. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the 5600G, and you're going to notice a difference here. I upscaled the resolution to 1080p, used 16 times anisotropic filtering, used FXAA, and 4 times MSAA. Notice the frame rate dropped when I activated the Super. I think ultimately I should have set it to 720p. I don't really think lowering MSAA to 2x would have made much of a difference. One thing I want to mention is that the Wii U does have to compile shader cache, and this can affect the frame rate, but I don't think that that's what's happening here. Okay. All right, next up is the 2060 i9-9900K combo. I upscaled it to 4K, turned on FXAA, used 8x MSAA, and here were the results. Once again, not much usage coming out of the CPU, while the GPU is definitely doing work and is fluctuating sometimes, hitting 90%, but not staying there very long. What really stands out to me about the Wii U emulator is the fact that it utilizes more of the GPU than the CPU. If we just look back at the 32G, if we look back at the 3200G, let me just stop this for a minute. So like if we look back here, you can see little use of the GPU. But when we're using like XEMU, those cores were really pushed. So it's kind of really interesting to kind of see that. All right. All right. All right, so now it's time to get into the big leagues, also known as the 7th generation. And we're going to start with the Cemu, the Wii U emulator. I decided to go with Breath of the Wild because I know we can increase the frame rate, and I wanted to see if it was possible to get a consistent 40 frames per second on the 3200G. If you recalled in the previous video with the 5600G, I could not test this out because the resolution kept switching back to 4K 60. The same thing happened with the 3200G, but I was able to fix this by installing AMD software. For those that don't know, if you have a 120Hz TV or monitor, using 40 frames per second is recommended because 120Hz divides cleanly by 40, meaning your screen will refresh 3 times for every frame, which makes for perfect timing, ultimately making sure animations look smooth with no stuttering. It also helps to decrease the input delay as well, so just a lot of benefits for using 40 frames per second versus the normal 30 frames per second. Okay, so I kept settings at their default for this one and decided to do my test at the Kakariko village. Unfortunately, the frame rate is not giving me a consistent 40 frames per second. Obviously, both the CPU and GPU are both being worked here, but I want to say it's ultimately the GPU that seems to be the limiting factor here. I do notice, however, the CPU is not hitting that boost clock of 4 gigahertz, and it definitely makes me wonder if that would have made a difference if it did. Another thing that I haven't brought up until now is the temperature on a 3200G. You can definitely see that it's getting pretty high. As I understand it, the 3200G can hit 95 degrees Celsius, which can lead to throttling or even the computer shutting down if it gets to that point. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the 5600G here. As I mentioned before, I kept it to 30 frames per second. I upscaled it to 1080p and also used 16 times anisotropic filtering. It does look like we also are GPU limited here. The CPU really only seems to have one core that is really getting pushed, and it's fluctuating when it comes to that CPU clock speed, periodically going to 4.4 gigahertz at times. So I really do believe I could have got this game to run at 40 frames per second on the 5600G. And I kind of regret capturing, not capturing it so that you guys could see that. Okay. All right, just giving it a minute to just get all the way up here so you can kind of just see the how things are going. Okay. I just kind of wanted to get a good shot of, kind of get a good capture of this, kind of looking down at the town to see how that would affect the performance. All right, finally we have the Big Daddy, the 2060 i9-9900K combination. All right, and let me go ahead and pull that up here. For settings, I upscaled the resolution to 1440p, selected 16 times anisotropic filtering, and 60 frames per second, and here is the result. Most of the cores and the threads seem to be active here, but they don't seem to really be putting in too much work. Every once in a while, you might see a core hit 90%, but it's not even for a second. In terms of GPU, it's mainly in the 50th percentile, but it does get up to 60 in some spots. I'm pretty certain that if I paired the 2060, with the 5600G, the 60 frames per second would maybe have been possible. So all right. So now we're going to get into the Xenia Canary, which is the Xbox 360 emulator. All right. Okay. This was another emulator that I did not showcase back in the original 3200G video. For this one, I'm going to go with Lost Odyssey. All the settings are at their default in this case. Just like Cemu, I do believe we are GPU limited here as well. The cores aren't nearly working as hard as what we saw with the XEMU, but the GPU is definitely being put through its paces, staying at 100% most of the time. And I'll just give it a second so you guys can just see some. Well, let me see here. We can put it at okay. All right, so let's go ahead and jump to the 5600G. All right. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure to just kind of push this forward a little bit more. All right. And it's the same scenario in terms of settings. The GPU is not getting pushed as hard as the 3200G. And while I noticed that, certain cores are definitely getting pushed, it still doesn't seem like the CPU is doing much of the lifting. Okay. It is interesting to me to see the clock speed on the CPU being much higher than that of the 3200G. And it definitely makes me wonder what is going on there. All right, so up next we have that 2060 paired with its partner, the i9-9900K. All right, let me pull that up here. Let me just forward this here so you can get into the actual action here. Okay. And this time I've made one adjustment here using the 60 frames per second patch. Even with the frame rate boost, there isn't anything that really stands out here. The GPU isn't using very much. At the most, you're seeing 40% usage. You might be wondering why I didn't use the 60 frames the 60 frames patch with the 5600G. And that's a really good question. Honestly, I just did not believe that it would have been able to hit 60. But I really based that on my tests with the Cemu and the RPCS3, which both came up short when trying to target that frame rate. So it was just kind of like, I probably should have tested it. Okay. All right, and we have finally reached the last emulator on this list, the RPCS3 PlayStation 3 emulator. All right, and so let me go ahead and switch that here. And the game I selected for this is the Demon Souls. I decided to go with the previous footage for the 3200G. As I've said in the previous 3200G video, RPCS3 is basically a no-go with this, with this hardware. I should really elaborate on that and why I personally feel this way. If you look at the recommended requirements on the RPCS3 website, they suggest you have a CPU with 6 cores and 12 threads. The minimum requirement for the RPCS3 is a CPU with 4 cores and 8 threads. Anything lower is expected to run, and I quote, very badly. The 3200G is 4 core and 4 threads, so it doesn't even meet the minimum recommendation, and this shows. All right. Now, of course, there are going to be some PS3 titles that are not as demanding as Demon Souls, but I'm pretty sure that you want to play most of the AAA titles that were developed for the console. Okay, so as you can see, it is totally CPU limited. The GPU isn't really being utilized that much, and the temps are getting as high as 100 degrees Celsius. All right. All right, so now let's look at the 5600G. And you can see things are about to vastly improve here. For the first time since we started doing the comparisons, 2 of the cores are at 100%. So from that alone, the CPU is doing some serious work here. Okay. In terms of the overclock speed, it does fluctuate. I mean, sorry, I said in terms of the overall clock speed, it does fluctuate, but it's hitting that boost clock every once in a while. So the GPU for the most part has stayed pretty low, hitting 50% at sometimes, but nothing higher than that. Okay. In terms of settings, I did upscale to 1080p and turn on FSR, which, if I understand it correctly, should be giving me 1440p. I did try using 1440p with FSR, but I ran into an issue that caused the game to start blanking in and out. So just kind of giving me a black screen going back and forth. In another game, it totally like kind of decimated it as far as like the visuals. It was looking like double screened. So I don't exactly know what's going on with that. Okay. All right, and last we have the Omega, the 26 coupled with the i9-9900K. And let me go ahead and pull that up. Okay, and here are the results. We can see that every core and thread is being worked. I did unlock the frame rate for 60 frames per second, but even with this CPU, it cannot hit that consistently. So I opted to force 40 frames per second, and that seems to be a good fit. Okay. As with the 5600G, the GPU isn't doing a great deal of work here, and I have it upscaled to 4K without even the use of without the use of FSR. So there you have it. Hopefully this has been insightful. It has been a consensus that having a good CPU is important for emulation. But as you can see, having a good GPU is just as important depending upon which emulator you're using. I'm hoping next year to either upgrade my i9-9900K or the 3200G. Just all depends. I'm really interested in the AMD Ryzen 800 series of APUs, which are supposed to be releasing at the end of January. I do expect we're going to definitely see a huge boost in GPU performance, as those are supposed to be using the RDNA architecture. And so I'm definitely curious about that. Okay. All right. Signing off for the rest of the year. Wishing you guys all the best for New Year. And I'm going to hopefully have a lot more content for you in 2024.